David Morrison's last thought when his private jet lost control was about the unfinished deal. When he opened his eyes, the paramedic saving him was Sophia Chen, the fiancée he had abandoned 15 years ago when he learned she was pregnant, and now she held his life in her hands. David Morrison sat in the cabin of his Gulfstream G650, reviewing the final details of the Singapore deal on his tablet. The 45-year-old millionaire businessman, CEO of Morrison Tech Industries, was accustomed to using every minute with maximum efficiency. This 3-hour flight from Denver to San Francisco was simply transition time between business meetings. Pilot Jerry Davidson and co-pilot Mike Chen were checking the latest meteorological reports in the cockpit. Light turbulence was expected over the Rocky Mountains, but this was routine for the experienced crew. David always worked during flights, hating any waste of time. His success largely stemmed from this disciplined approach to productivity. While the aircraft flew smoothly at 35,000 feet, David prepared his presentation for tomorrow's meeting with Singapore partners. The $200 million technology transfer deal would position his company as a leader in the Asian market. Every slide had to be perfect, every figure verified, no detail could be overlooked. David's assistant Lisa sent a message that the LA meeting had been postponed. David felt irritated because he hated schedule changes. He immediately turned to his keyboard and began researching alternative dates. Control was everything to him. Morrison Tech Industries had been founded 18 years ago in his garage, becoming a major player in the technology sector through his insane work pace and strategic risk-taking abilities. His innovations in cloud computing and artificial intelligence had brought his company to billion-dollar valuations. His success story had become legendary in the business world. But this success came at a price. David had completely neglected his personal life, severing connections with family and friends. Everything he had gained in the business world, he had lost in his private life. His greatest loss had been Sophia Chen. Suddenly, the aircraft experienced violent turbulence. David's tablet flew from his hands and cabin items scattered everywhere. Pilot Jerry's voice echoed through the speakers. "Mr. Morrison, fasten your seatbelt. We've encountered unexpected weather conditions." David fastened his seatbelt while trying to gather his scattered documents. Through the window, he could see dark storm clouds surrounding the aircraft. The plane shook with increasing violence, and warning lights began flashing on the instrument panel. Jerry's voice came again, this time with obvious concern. "We're experiencing technical difficulties. Please prepare for emergency procedures." David felt his stomach drop. In all his years of flying, he had never heard such tension in Jerry's voice. The next few minutes passed in terrifying chaos. The aircraft dropped altitude rapidly, oxygen masks deployed, and David found himself pressed against his seat by G-forces he had never experienced. Through the cockpit radio, he could hear Jerry and Mike working frantically to regain control of the aircraft. David's mind raced between fear and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. He had too many responsibilities, too many deals pending, too many people depending on his decisions. The Singapore presentation was tomorrow, the board meeting next week. The quarterly earnings report needed his final approval. But as the aircraft continued its uncontrolled descent toward the Colorado mountains, David realized that none of those business concerns mattered if he didn't survive the next few minutes. For the first time in years, he was completely powerless, unable to control or influence the outcome through negotiation, money, or strategic thinking. The impact came with devastating force. David's last conscious thought was about the unfinished Singapore deal. The presentation slides still scattered across the cabin floor, and the realization that his empire might continue without him. Then everything went black. When consciousness returned, David's first sensation was pain, radiating through his entire body. His head throbbed with intensity that made thinking difficult, and every breath sent sharp spikes through his chest. He could hear voices around him, professional medical terminology being exchanged with urgent efficiency. Patient is conscious. Possible concussion. Multiple contusions. Suspected internal bleeding. A woman's voice was saying, The voice was calm and authoritative, clearly someone with extensive medical training who was accustomed to emergency situations. David tried to open his eyes, but the effort sent waves of pain through his skull. He could feel hands examining him with practiced competence, checking his pulse, testing his responses, coordinating with other medical personnel who had apparently arrived at the crash site. "Sir, can you hear me? Try not to move. We're going to get you out of here," the same female voice said, closer now. There was something familiar about the tone, the cadence, the way she pronounced certain words that triggered memories David couldn't quite grasp through the fog of pain and medication. David managed to force his eyes open despite the discomfort. Above him, a woman in paramedic uniform was adjusting an IV line while monitoring his vital signs. She wore a cap that covered most of her hair, and her face was focused entirely on her medical duties rather than his identity. But those eyes were unmistakably familiar. Dark brown, intelligent, compassionate in a way that spoke of someone who had chosen a career dedicated to helping others. David had looked into those same eyes 15 years ago when he had made the worst decision of his life. Sophia Chen worked with practiced efficiency around David's broken body, coordinating with her partner and the rescue team to stabilize him for transport to the trauma center. She showed no sign of recognition, her attention entirely focused on the medical emergency rather than any personal history they might share. David tried to speak, to say her name, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Sophia immediately leaned closer, thinking he was trying to communicate important medical information about his condition or symptoms that might affect his treatment. "What is it? Are you experiencing pain anywhere specific?" she asked, her voice professional but kind. David could see concern in her expression, the same compassion that had once made him fall in love with her before his ambition had destroyed their relationship. The memories came flooding back, despite the pain medication that was making everything seem dreamlike and distant. Sophia Chen, brilliant pre-med student at Stanford, the woman who had challenged him intellectually and loved him completely before he had chosen his startup company over their future together. They had met during David's final year at Stanford Business School, when Sophia was completing her undergraduate degree in biochemistry while preparing for medical school. Their relationship had been intense and passionate, built on shared ambition and mutual respect for each other's intelligence and drive. For 2 years, they had navigated the challenges of demanding academic schedules and uncertain career prospects, supporting each other through graduate school pressures in the early stages of David's entrepreneurial ventures. Sophia had believed in his business vision when no one else took him seriously, encouraging him during the countless rejections and setbacks that characterized his startup's early days. The engagement had come during David's second year building Morrison Tech, when the company was still operating out of his garage but showing signs of real potential. Sophia had just been accepted to medical school, and they had planned to marry after her graduation, building their careers together while supporting each other's professional goals. But the pregnancy had changed everything. Sophia had told David about it on a Thursday evening in March, sharing her joy and excitement about starting a family together. She had assumed that David would share her happiness, that their engagement meant they were ready to build a life that included children as well as careers. David's reaction had shattered both their dreams and their relationship. At 27, he was consumed with growing his company, working 18-hour days, and desperately trying to secure funding for the next phase of expansion. A child represented responsibility and distraction that he convinced himself he couldn't handle while trying to build a business empire. The conversation that followed had been brutal and final. David had explained to Sophia that he wasn't ready for fatherhood, that his company required complete focus for the next several years, that bringing a child into their unstable financial situation would be irresponsible for everyone involved. Sophia had listened with growing devastation as the man she loved reduced their unborn child to a business problem, requiring cost-benefit analysis. She had tried to explain that they could manage both parenthood and career building, that love and support could overcome financial challenges, that their child deserved better than being viewed as an obstacle to professional success. But David had been unmovable in his position. He had offered to pay for the procedure that would eliminate their problem, allowing both of them to continue pursuing their individual goals without complications. When Sophia had refused to consider that option, David had made his choice clear. He had told Sophia that if she chose to continue the pregnancy, she would do so without his involvement or support. He wouldn't be part of a child's life, wouldn't provide financial assistance, and wouldn't allow fatherhood to derail the company that was beginning to show real promise of success. Sophia had left his apartment that night and never returned. The engagement ring he had given her was left on his kitchen counter along with a note that simply said she had thought he was a better man than he had proven to be. David had convinced himself that he was making a mature, practical decision that served everyone's long-term interests. Now, 15 years later, David found himself entirely dependent on Sophia's professional skills and medical expertise. The irony was overwhelming that the woman whose heart he had broken and whose child he had rejected was now working to save his life with the same dedication and competence she brought to every patient. The rescue operation continued with David drifting in and out of consciousness as Sophia and her team worked to stabilize him for transport to the nearest trauma center. He could hear radio communications coordinating helicopter evacuation, discussions of his injuries and treatment requirements, and Sophia's calm voice directing the medical response. Through his medication-induced haze, David could see that Sophia had become exactly the kind of medical professional she had dreamed of being during their time together. Her competence was evident in how other rescue workers deferred to her judgment, how efficiently she managed multiple emergency procedures simultaneously, and how her presence seemed to calm both patients and colleagues in crisis situations. The helicopter ride to Denver Health Medical Center passed in a blur of medical equipment, worried voices, and increasing pain as David's body began fully processing the trauma from the crash. Sophia remained with him throughout the flight, monitoring his condition and adjusting his treatment as his vital signs changed. David learned later that the crash had been caused by a combination of severe weather and mechanical failure that overwhelmed even Jerry and Mike's considerable piloting skills. Both pilots had survived, but with serious injuries that would require months of recovery. David had been the most critically injured of the three, suffering internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and a concussion that could have been fatal without immediate medical intervention. At the trauma center, Sophia handed David's care over to the surgical team while providing a detailed report of his condition, treatment administered during rescue and transport, and recommendations for continued care. Her professionalism was absolute, treating David like any other patient requiring emergency medical services. David underwent emergency surgery to repair internal injuries and stabilize his condition for the long recovery process that lay ahead. During the procedure, he remained unconscious while Sophia returned to her normal duties, responding to other emergency calls throughout the Denver metropolitan area. When David woke in the ICU 2 days later, his first conscious thought was about Sophia and the impossible coincidence that had brought her back into his life under these circumstances. He had spent 15 years successfully avoiding any contact with her, building his empire while trying to forget the personal costs of his single-minded focus on professional success. The nurses caring for David mentioned that the paramedic who had rescued him was considered one of the best in the region, known for her skill in complex emergency situations and her dedication to continuing education in trauma medicine. They spoke of Sophia with obvious respect and admiration, describing someone who had clearly found deep satisfaction in her chosen career. David's business associates began arriving as soon as his condition stabilized, updating him on deals that required his attention and decisions that couldn't wait for his full recovery. But for the first time in his professional life, David found himself unable to focus entirely on business concerns. The crash had forced him to confront his own mortality in ways that made quarterly earnings and market share seem suddenly less significant. More disturbing was the realization that if he had died in the crash, his business empire would have continued functioning while he faced death completely alone, with no personal relationships or family connections to provide comfort or meaning. Sophia had clearly moved on from their relationship, building a successful career that brought meaning and purpose to her daily life. David wondered whether she had married, whether she had other children, whether the child they might have had together had become part of some other family structure. The questions haunted David during his recovery, but he made no effort to contact Sophia or learn more about her current life. She had made it clear through her professional behavior during the rescue that their past relationship was exactly that, a closed chapter that had no relevance to their present circumstances. David's injuries required several weeks of hospitalization, followed by months of physical therapy and gradual return to normal activities. During this forced slowdown, he found himself reassessing priorities and life choices that he had never questioned while building his business empire. The Singapore deal had been successfully completed by David's international team, proving that his company could function effectively without his constant oversight. Other negotiations had proceeded smoothly under the management of executives he had trained, but never fully trusted with independent authority. Morrison Tech Industries continued to thrive during David's absence, generating profits and expanding market share while he focused on healing from the crash. The realization that his empire was less dependent on his personal involvement than he had believed forced David to confront assumptions about his own indispensability. More significantly, the crash had reminded David of the personal costs of his success-driven lifestyle. He had built financial security and professional recognition while sacrificing the relationships that might have provided meaning and connection during moments of crisis or reflection. 6 months after the crash, David received a news article about Sophia's promotion to Emergency Medical Services Coordinator for the Denver region, recognizing her 15 years of outstanding service and her contributions to improving emergency response protocols. The article mentioned her expertise in trauma medicine and her role in training new paramedics. The article included a photograph of Sophia receiving her award, surrounded by colleagues and what appeared to be family members celebrating her achievement. David studied the image carefully, noting that Sophia looked happy and fulfilled, clearly having found the career satisfaction and personal meaning that had eluded him despite his financial success. David realized that Sophia had not only survived his abandonment, but had flourished, building exactly the kind of meaningful life that he had convinced himself required sacrificing personal relationships. She had found professional fulfillment while apparently maintaining the personal connections that gave her life depth and purpose beyond career achievements. The crash that nearly killed David had ultimately become a catalyst for reassessing his definition of success and his understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. Seeing Sophia again, even briefly and in such dramatic circumstances, had reminded him of the path not taken and the personal costs of his business-focused existence. David began making changes in his approach to work and life, delegating more responsibilities to capable associates and creating space for relationships and activities that had nothing to do with profit margins or market expansion. The empire he had built could function without his constant oversight, and he could find satisfaction in pursuits that contributed to others' welfare rather than just his own wealth accumulation. Morrison Tech Industries established a foundation focused on supporting emergency medical services and trauma research, funding that would help train paramedics like Sophia and improve emergency response capabilities in underserved communities. David administered the foundation personally, finding meaning in work that directly contributed to saving lives rather than just generating profits. The foundation's first major grant went to the Denver Emergency Medical Services Training Program, where Sophia worked, providing funding for new equipment and advanced training protocols. David made sure the donation was anonymous, wanting to support Sophia's important work without creating any personal complications or obligations. David never attempted to contact Sophia directly or to learn details about her personal life beyond what was publicly available through professional recognition and news coverage. He understood that she had moved beyond their past relationship to build something meaningful and satisfying, and he had no right to intrude on the life she had created. But the memory of Sophia's competence and dedication during his rescue served as a constant reminder of the kind of person he had lost through his own limitations and misplaced priorities. She had become exactly what she had dreamed of becoming during their time together, while he had achieved financial success at the cost of personal fulfillment and authentic connection. The paramedic who had saved David's life in the Colorado mountains had also saved him from a life of empty achievement by showing him, through her example of meaningful work and apparent personal satisfaction, that success could be measured by contribution rather than accumulation. David would always be grateful to Sophia Chen for more than just the medical expertise that had saved his life after the crash. She had inadvertently shown him possibilities for redemption and meaning that his wealth alone could never provide, and had inspired him to use his resources in ways that honored the values she had tried to teach him 15 years too late.